It's finally that time of year again. And as it does every October 31st, the time has finally come to review this, thankfully unforgotten gem, thanks to a remaster-styled remake from the Graveyard Up that came out in 2019. This is a game that I've played for the first time only a few years ago back in 2015 or 16 and just immediately fell in love with it. I've been wanting to make a video on it ever since, but other games came in the way. Anyways, I guess I'm spoiling my thoughts of this game by throwing out the fact that this is my absolute favorite game to play during autumn, and it's like a tradition for me to be playing this, Apogee's Monster Bash, or any one of the Castlevania games, or American McGee's Alice. Not only that, but it's my #1 favorite game on the Sony PlayStation, as well as one of my favorite games of all time. But why is that, you might ask? What makes this game so special?
Let's find out.
And if you're my friend outside of here and have been a victim to my ongoing obsessive ramblings about this game, you're probably wondering why I never shut the hell up about it. So gather around the gravestones and trees, my friends, because this is going to be a good one. Hopefully. If you're wondering how such a crazy game came to be, let's go back to the year 1995. A movie called The Nightmare Before Christmas is released, and it inspired all the goth kids all over the school to make weird, creepy art, causing the other Hispanic kids to point and be like, "Hey, you a rocker, fool?" It also inspired a guy to make a game. This guy being someone named Chris Sorrell, who was one of the leads in an independent development company called Millennium Interactive in Cambridge, UK. He was previously known for all his work on the James Pond games, so fellow Amiga fans should be familiar with him. Around the time he was working on James Pond 3, he was asked what he wanted to do next, to which he responded that he wanted to work more on the visual side of things on a game. He proposed a game called Dead Man Dan and described a game that was kinda like Ghosts and Goblins with the art style of, you guessed it, Nightmare Before Christmas. As development progressed, the lead artist pushed the game to a more Zelda-like inspired RPG direction, as opposed to the original arcade ideas. They also wanted a unique lead character. Lead script Dr. Martin Pond came up with the idea to make this guy have been a pompous failure in life, whose reincarnation was his sole shot at redemption. I'm not really sure who decided to make him a skeleton specifically, but that backstory along with his strange and unique design apparently led to some female gamers considering him to be endearing and led him to be considered a sex symbol in France? What? Huh? In an attempt to attract a big publishing deal, the studio began working on a Windows PC and Sega Saturn port for the game as well, on top of the Sony PlayStation one, which was the one that at this point they put most of their current work into. This led to them making a demo to show Sony, which led to them being impressed by their progress and signing the game as a PlayStation exclusive. Come pretty shortly after all this, Sony bought out the entire Millennium Development Studio, along with their projects in development, and basically renamed Millennium to SCE Cambridge, as well as commissioning them as Sony's second studio in the UK. This was the studio's first 3D game, and nobody on the team really had much experience with that stuff. This led to some really frustrating challenges regarding the game's camera. In the beginning, the camera was set on rails and would follow Dan as he moved around the map. Some time passed until they decided to make the camera behind and focus on Dan in order to freely explore around the level. They eventually played beta versions of successful games like Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot in order to help them get a better idea on what to do, and I think it did help to some extent, but they've already implemented the new camera system by that point. So in turn, Medieval's camera was still different from those games and was still clunkier and a little bit harder to use than both of those. But it turned out okay though. Along with the camera, adding analog controls was a challenge at the studio. It was tough as expected, but they did eventually get it working. And this led to Dan having some really precise movement controls that rivaled other 3D games at the time, especially Tomb Raider, at least on PlayStation. I'll get to that a little bit later though. So moving forward, random fun little fact, during the marketing campaign, the team frequently went to graveyards for photo shoots. Most of the time these went incidentless, but Oh no, my dogs are barking. Most of the time these went incidentless, but apparently there was a time when somebody asked why they were recording on church property. The team then lied by saying that they were film students filming a documentary on churches. Absolute chads. I would have probably done the same. Some of the commercials reflect these graveyard visits too and make for some really awesome watches. I would have probably pissed my pants and begged my parents at the same time for this game if I saw any of these as a kid.
Don't ask me a question, ask me.
You know Sir Dan?
Yes, I knew Sir Don. Skinny guy, dark teeth, one eyeball. Disgusting.
That Dan, always getting into trouble. Well, I mean, what do you expect? Hanging around in graveyards. He was an odd fellow, clubbing zombies with chicken drumsticks. Hey! What's the geraniums? What have I told you?
Sir Dan, always babbling about honor and stuff. So somebody woke you up from the dead to fight the forces of evil. Big deal! Go with it!
PlayStation.
Willkommen zurück, Schatz.
Das Gruselabenteuer des Jahres. Medieval.
The game continued to be marketed up until it got released as Medieval. Not medieval with an A, but medieval because puns, I guess. And it was published by Sony and released on October 9th in Europe and a tad later on October 21st here in the States, both in 1998. There were two versions released in Europe, not including the ones in other languages. The first one was the official European release, which I don't have yet, but it's more or less the same as what I do have, so I'll just show you some pictures. Here's the front, the back, and the disc. Kind of like America has the greatest hits re-releases for PS1, Europe had these things called platinum hits. Somehow, it didn't strike the 200k goal it needed for that over here despite massive popularity, but it did pass the 400k it needed over there for the platinum release. This version didn't really have anything different aside from that platinum hits thing over there at the bottom of the cover, a now really ugly looking CD, and the same manual. But also a really cool little poster thing that took a hint from the strategy guide, showing a map of some of the levels and everything in them. Prices for both of these are pretty much the same, nothing insane, but they're around 20 to 40 US dollars, so not nearly as bad as you're probably used to considering the prices of some of these things nowadays, but they're rather affordable, I would say. Before the game got released here in America, we got two demo CDs. The first one I don't have myself either, but it was housed in a little cardboard sleeve thing. It contained, I believe, the exact same disc as the next version, but not certain. This second one, which I do thankfully have, was mailed out to people who were subscribed to PlayStation Underground magazine. This thing is probably my favorite of all of the physical PS1 stuff I own as of this video, along with my Kingsfield Longbox and Galarian's limited edition and the Japanese version of this game. It's a dual-sided pop-up thingy and it's really cool to display. The back says, "Trick or treat, look inside." And then on the front it says, "Your journey into eternal darkness begins this Halloween. See what's lurking inside." And then you can kind of push it upwards to reveal the disc with a really neat, eye-pleasing style gothic pattern. Behind it has Fortesque's grave, along with a little quote, and now that it's popped up you can turn it back around to view an image of Dan and a little blurb to get you to want to play the game. Thankfully, even in the current pandemic era of insane retro game prices and robbery and scalping, this thing will only run you about 20 to 40 bucks, which is quite a bit for something that was essentially a free demo, but considering it's a collectible and how cool it is and how it's much more scarce than the retail game, I think that's pretty fair. But I wouldn't personally suggest spending anything more than that, unless you're like a really die-hard fan of the game or series, like someone I know. Then shortly after came the version we got here, which is pretty much an Americanized version of the original PAL release. This was a copy I got personally since, yeah, I do be living in America.
Do I know you?
Me? No. No, sir. I'm just an old Palizanders here.
Here's the spine, the back, the game manual in glorious full color, looking like you're reading it in some sort of castle or dungeon, housing the info on how to play the game with some added backstory and other stuff, and the game disc itself. I also really like how the artwork takes up 2 spaces and looks bigger when you take the disc out. I don't think I worded that right at all, but it's always cool to me when jewel cases do that extended artwork thingy. All the US copies came with the sweepstakes slip. All US copies came with the sweepstakes slip. Say that 3 times fast. You could fill these out and mail them to Sony for them to put you in a drawing for a trip to London. Which is pretty cool, but I have no idea who won or what kind of experience they had there. If they went to Sony or just, London in general. My copy did not come with one, and it seems like most copies on eBay are also missing that too. Regarding the prices for this one, I was surprised to find that this game hasn't really gone up that much like everything else over here. It's not exactly cheap, but that depends on what your definition of cheap is. I got mine for about $40 in 2016, and now it'll probably run you $30 to $60, which I honestly think is worth it considering how great this game is. I'm not sure about Europe, but we did get an official strategy guide here in the States, and while it looks cheap and flimsy at first, hear me out, this is actually a really good one. It feels pretty big despite being so thin, it's in full color, has detailed maps with full puzzle solutions and explanations, item locations, bestiary, full colored renders of the Hall heroes, and many other things. The 2 negatives of this though are how freaking thin and fragile it is, making it really difficult to take proper care of unless you just leave it in your shelf. And the other thing is how crazy expensive this thing can get. Seriously, this thing is often even more expensive than the game itself, which is kinda stupid. I was really lucky and I got this for like $18 earlier this year, but I mean look at it. Look at this, it's got like water damage or some shit. But I only say to seek this out if you're a huge fan of the game and you want to know every single thing you can about it. Otherwise it might just be more trouble than it's worth. And the last version of the game, the Japanese version, was the final one with the release date of June 17th, 1999. Why? Well, things get a little more interesting with this version as it has its own exclusive changes in game. Mostly cosmetic, yeah, sure, but they're still really cool, and I'll get to it more later in the video. As for this physical release, I love this, and it's honestly another one of my favorite things in my PS1 collection, alongside the other things I already mentioned. First off, the cover is awesome, looking a little bit less gothic and more medieval. It looks like some sort of old worn map. Dan looks like some chibi guy for some reason, because Japan I guess. Here's the back if you wanted to take a look at that. The obi strip that came with these if you bought them brand new. For those that don't know, pretty much every Japanese form of media that came on a jewel case, like on anything ever, came with one of these on the side. So most of the time people threw them away. There's also an ad. What I'm assuming is a registration card. The game disc itself, which has a bunch of screenshots on it and is really glossy and nice to touch. And lastly, this manual. And I gotta hand it to them. They definitely went all out on this release. I mean, look at this. The manual is in full color and looks awesome, which is already a plus. But what really caught me off guard was that unlike most other games where they use screenshots, including the other versions of this game, this manual has those parts where it's explaining how things work in the game, except instead of screenshots, they're full-colored, painstakingly hand-drawn moments of the game. Super creative and cool stuff, and it just really gives it that extra touch of a medieval feeling. This version sold horrendously due to a skeleton protagonist being considered really strange over there, and even then those few people who actually bought it threw away that Obi strip in the ads and stuff, so it was kind of a gargantuan pain in the spine to find a complete copy, let alone at all. I burned about $60 for this thing, which is quite a bit, but it was fully worth it in my opinion, considering how rare it was, how good of a condition it was in, and also, again, that it's my favorite game on the entire system's catalog. So, if you want one for yourself, you can probably find it for about the same price that I did, but just be prepared to do some real searching if you want it complete. A reimagining was developed on the PSP in 2005 titled Medieval Resurrection, but I feel like it's different enough to have its own video, so not gonna talk about it in here. And lastly, there was a ground-up remake on the PS4, simply titled Medieval. But unlike most remakes going for a reboot approach, this one is more in the vein of a remaster. It's the same game with the same levels, but much better graphics. Graphics, not art. Improved controls and mechanics, and tons of extra content. I'll discuss this version as well as the Japanese one later on in the video, but as for most of this video, I'm going to be talking about the original PS1 version that launched here in America. My friend pre-ordered the remake for me knowing how huge of a fan of the series I was, so it was a day one play for me. Thanks Nick, big appreciated. I was pretty disappointed with the physical release itself, since it's like most PS4 games and just has a case with a disc inside it. And even the disc has like 5% of the actual game on it, which kind of ruins the whole point of getting it physically in the first place. I mean, come on. Why are you going to release a physical copy of something that should be tangible on a disc, and only have like 3% of it? It's like one of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to collecting modern games. It ruins the entire point of getting the game physically, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The cover and the back look really cool, so I guess that makes it worth it to some people. I don't know. Honestly speaking, you're better off getting the digital deluxe version of the game on the PSN store, since you don't need to keep the disc in, and you get the bonus goodies like the PS4 theme, the digital soundtrack, comics, an art book, and other stuff. Though physical copies are cheaper, for some reason. They're like $10, while the digital one is $30 normally. So if you want a cheaper route, then I guess go for that. But it would probably be more convenient to get the digital one, in this case, sadly. I wanted to explain the original website for the game like I usually do, but this was one of those that needed Adobe Flash to work, and that's kind of a nightmare in of itself to get working again. So for now, just take my word for what was on there, and look at the 2 screenshots that I have. Basically, it explained the backstory, some of the history of Gallowmere, and some of the weapons you can get in the Hall of Heroes, as well as some of the screenshots and a little Hangman game, which was pretty cool, but again, you can't play that because Flash. I didn't actually play this when it came out, both because of not actually having a console, and also because I was just barely about to turn 1 and didn't have any concept of games yet. Over the course of the next few years of my life, my best friends at the time had a PS1 and played on it lifelessly, but I had a PC, so I played everything on there. My friends that actually had the system didn't have this game, so I didn't really know anything about it. I vaguely remember someone at school talking about it around Halloween time, but that's really it. Fast forward to a bit more of a recent time when I saw a review on it one day in 2016-ish, if I had to guess, and I was immediately drawn to its art style, music, gameplay, and pretty much everything. So I made it next on my to-get list despite its price, and to my not so big surprise, I ended up loving the game even more than I thought I would. I was having so much fun, but I also loved, like, literally everything about it, and it's pretty much become a favorite of mine ever since. Whenever you're ready, plop the disc into your PlayStation, poke that power button, and let it all sink in. It boots up with an introductory movie thing, but I'll go over that whenever I go over the story, which is in a sec. And then once that's done, you'll be greeted by one of the coolest main menus ever. One of my favorites and gets me in the Halloween mood every single time I boot it up. Here, you can only start a new game, load a game, or you could leave it alone and just let the camera sway around the spooky graveyard some more. So whenever you're ready, either whenever you're ready, either wait and watch that, or start up a new game. The story begins long ago in the fictional land of Gallowmere with an evil sorcerer named Zarok. Basically, this guy just hates people for being peaceful, so he starts to conjure up an army of demons and zombies and whatnot. According to legend, the king's champion, a man named Sir Daniel Fortesque, led the militia into battle against this army of creatures. Evil creatures fell before every swing he cast, and he single-handedly slain Zarok. He was the legendary champion of Gallowmere. But according to, well, reality, that's not the case at all. In fact, he actually died from the very first arrow that was shot. Fast forward 100 years later, and Zarok is somehow still alive and pretty much redid what he did back then, conjuring up an army of undead creatures. Unfortunately for him, Dead Man Dan just happened to be one of them, and so the game begins with him waking up in his crypt as you take control of him. The gargoyles that greet him know about his history in the books versus what actually happened. They even reduce your presence by referring to you as it when you're around them. You know, British humor. But they tell him that since Zarok is up and about with his dicknanigans.
Dicknanigans?
Shenanigans. Why am I like this? But they tell him that since Zarok is up and about with his shenanigans, he can stop him and redeem himself from the past. And thus, your journey into eternal darkness begins. Right away you're set off to explore the crypt, and while you don't have a weapon in your hand just yet, to my amusement I found you could rip your arm off and beat things to death with it, or throw it around like a boomerang. Once its amusement on you fades, it's up to you to stop Zarok by going through 20 plus awesomely designed levels, but only after going through the crypt. This is essentially a tutorial level without being a forced tutorial and done more to build the world, which I really like and appreciate. You can read these books coincidentally laid out for you if it's your first time playing, or don't, it doesn't really matter. Grab the key and other items, leave the crypt, and it's time to set foot into the graveyard, the real first level of the game, and you'll immediately see how supremely atmospheric this game is. Dozens and dozens of details and visuals that really help make you feel like you're in this weird, creepy, like Tim Burton-esque world. That's not to say it's scary, because I mean it's not, but it does still have a little bit of a creepy feel to it due to its atmosphere. And the visual themes and designs of the levels, the overall art, the music, and the story all play a pretty big part in that. At the same time, the game is driven by an effective dose of humor, and as a result, you gotta go out of your way to try to take the game seriously, but you're not really supposed to, and that's kind of the beauty of it all. Don't let that discourage you if you're looking for a spooky game, since the humor is actually done really well in conjunction with the game. The jokes are placed at the right time and they're all well executed, and despite the pretty dark atmosphere, the jokes never really feel out of place. And to have such a strong balance between gothic atmosphere and humor, I think is really impressive to properly pull off. You've probably already taken note of how beautiful the game's visuals are the moment you saw the main menu. And despite the age and primitiveness, I think the art team did such a phenomenal job that they still look very beautiful and charming even today and hold up quite well. People always say 90s games have aged like shit in the graphics department, but I wholeheartedly disagree. It depends on the game and the art. Cause yeah, of course, early polygonal stuff does look kinda weird and dated now, but if you have an art team that knows exactly what they're doing, then the game is still gonna look good and effective at what it's trying to achieve. I mean, just look at Silent Hill for example. That game also looks primitive by today's standards, but it's still considered one of the scariest games of all frickin' time, 20 plus years later when we have games that look legitimately lifelike. On top of that, this is one of those games that you'd really need to play on a CRT. Playing it on a CRT makes all the textures much smoother, have the proper colors and mixture between darkness and bright lighting, and it just makes everything look and feel right. Playing on a modern HD TV will ruin the colors, make everything look muddy and blurry, and will make the textures look like they're in a lower resolution and pixelated more than they're supposed to. This isn't just exclusive to Medieval itself, but it goes for pretty much everything in the 90s and earlier, and for most games in the early 2000s. They were fully designed for use with these TVs, and as such used some visual tricks that made them look superb. So that's another culprit of people thinking what they're looking at now is way worse than what they remember when they played it. Another thing is emulation, which I think makes the game look not quite as good either. I mean, don't get me wrong, it does look smoothed up, but it looks a bit too smooth for my taste, and it kind of gives an artificial look to it, which I personally just don't like. Or when people play it in a modern resolution and it stretches everything out and it's really painful to look at. The opinion's gonna vary from person to person, but I would totally take black bars over stretched footage any day of the week. Team black bars for the win. On top of that is the input delay that emulators have, making it kinda harder to play games like this that need more precise controls for platforming. And I think that goes for a lot of other PS1 games too. They look and feel best on real hardware on a CRT, preferably a Sony Trinitron. PS2 era games on the other hand, I think look just fine emulated. I haven't really had any issues with any of those aside from the original Ratchet & Clank, though they still don't feel quite as good or smooth without being played on a CRT, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The PS4 version of the game that came as an unlockable for 100%ing the remake was emulated, and they did a great job with it. It looks and plays and feels great, though it still doesn't quite look as good as it does playing on a CRT either. It's hard to actually complain about it though. If you don't want to deal with the bulk or chore of finding a CRT, that version is probably the best one to play. But the thing with that one is that you'd have to complete the remake as well as find all of the Lost Souls, complete all of their missions, so you'd have to really 100% the game. Which was really cool to me when I saw it there at first. I was completely thrown off guard that they just had the complete original game there for anyone to play. I also think the PS1 suits what they were going for pretty much perfectly. It really makes the game feel like a Tim Burton-esque thing, even though it's a game and not a claymation movie. The controls are pretty good for the most part. You do have to get used to the button placement, but they're easy to get used to after maybe a level or two. The game does support analog controls thankfully, like I mentioned earlier, so you can use a DualShock or PS2 controller if you want, which is strongly recommended. You can use the left analog stick to move down, right analog stick to do nothing, left and right shoulder buttons, L1 and R1 to change the camera, even if a bit wonky, triangle to dash after unlocking the ability or hold it to block if you have a shield equipped, circle to jump, X to do a basic attack with your selected weapon, and hold square and release to do a powerful charged attack. You usually feel in control of Dan, though this game was pretty primitive for 3D at the time and they didn't have a specific control method figured out for games outside of tank controls and maybe Super Mario 64, and that's really it. So as a result, the jumping can feel really clunky and a little bit more difficult than it really needs to be to properly pull it off. And also the camera just doesn't work sometimes and has a mind of its own. Those are definitely some of the weakest points of the game, so if you've never played it, just make sure you go into it knowing the controls are a little flawed. But if you can deal with that, then this game is one hell of a treat. One thing I love that no other game of its kind has ever done as far as I know, was that they somehow programmed the game to rumble exactly to how Dan is moving. This made movement feel amazing. It's more specific to the position you're holding the analog compared to most of what other games at the time had, where it was just like a simple toggle on and off thing to run or not. Games didn't really have that specifically tight analog controls as the standard until at least another few years, and I think this was inspired by Super Mario 64. But even that game didn't have the rumbling like this. The further you push or pull the stick, the faster Dan runs, and every single time he makes a step on the ground, the controller will make a thumping vibration. The faster he moves, the stronger the vibration is. The slower he moves, the softer it is. It's such a small but effective thing that they added in. It's rather difficult to show you exactly how this works. You're probably gonna have to just take my word and feel it for yourself. Moving on to the main bulk, the gameplay. Medieval is, I guess, like an action-adventure game with elements from 3D platformers, I guess. I don't really know how to explain it. but I do know that this game is a ton of fun. You control Dan through, like I said earlier, 20 plus levels of gothic proportions. To sum it up, in these levels you'll solve puzzles and find keys as you try to find the exit to progress to the next level on the map. Sometimes it branches out to other paths, which is neat, but I wouldn't really call this like an outright Metroidvania or anything. It's still pretty linear at its core, so. Also, you'll be fighting enemies and bosses and whatnot along the way. The levels aren't too huge and will typically take you maybe 20 or 30 minutes on a very first time playthrough, if you're taking your time. But with enough practice, you'll probably be able to 100% each level in like 10 minutes. Their design is superb as well, both in terms of actual design with the layouts and placements of everything, and also their visual design. No two levels feel the same, with the exception of Return to the Graveyard and the Graveyard, but that just makes sense. And even that one feels different once you get past a certain point. You'll go from said graveyard to a Bob-omb Battlefield inspired cemetery hill, to a gothic mausoleum, to a pumpkin patch with evil pumpkins, an asylum, scarecrow fields, and even a town filled with people chasing you around trying to kill you. But you have to refrain from attacking them since they're actually innocent people that have been possessed by Xerox black magic. There's lots of other levels like this that are just so unique and creative, and I love it so much. There's also There's even a secret level where if you find this witch's talisman, you can go into the Enchanted Earth level and summon this witch, who shrinks you down to the size of a bug.
Didn't I mention I'd have to shrink you to the size of an insect? Now hurry back.
And you're tasked with going into ant caves to get bits of amber for her, while also being tasked to free these fairies with Bob Hoskins faces and Cockney gangster accents. And no, I couldn't make that up even if I tried.
Thank you for releasing me, sir. My people wish only to live our lives in blissful harmony with nature.
Out of all the levels I've played, my favorite is probably Haunted Ruins. It's a very tragic level with Dan going back to revisit his kingdom to the king that he stood by, only to find the entire place overrun with demons and King Peregrine dead. The skies are purple and pink with these black silhouettes of houses, and the overall atmosphere in this level is killer, with the music just stealing the show. A runner-up contender would probably be the Pumpkin Gorge, and I'm not entirely sure why, but if I had to guess, it's probably because of how autumny that level feels. I don't even think that's a word. Every single level offers something new and refreshing and has you doing something completely different from the last one. Every single level looks entirely different from the last instead of just being a generic asset swap. And every single time you try to go the extra mile with exploration or enemy killings, you get rewarded for it. I would argue this is objectively good game and level design, at least based on what I was taught in school. Let me elaborate on the rewards a little bit more. Every time you kill an enemy, their soul will fly upwards and into this golden chalice, along with the souls rate at the top of the screen increasing slightly. The goal is to fill up the chalice enough for it to solidify so that you can collect it. You don't have to kill every single creature to get the chalice, but the soul rate of the current level does have to reach 100% before the chalice solidifies and you're able to pick it up. These chalices aren't required to beat the game either, but more of a side thingy you can do, and you're strongly encouraged to get them as you progress, as each one gives you new items and weapons which will largely benefit you throughout the game. And also, you do need to have all 20 chalices to get the true, slightly extended and slightly better ending. These chalices are also often not directly in the way. They're usually in a hidden area or require some sort of puzzle to be solved, making them an added challenge in of themselves. And I personally really like this, because it gives you an incentive to go beyond what the game is asking you to do. The levels do require some exploration to understand what you gotta do, but I think for the most part they don't really get to a bad or overly confusing point. Some parts can, like trying to get the chalice for the lake level, since it never tells you that you have to pretty much walk directly in front of these white eyeballs to summon the enemies you need. And unless you specifically have 13 chalices and chose the magic sword by that point, you're gonna have a nightmare trying to kill off the individual enemies. Also, the Ghost Pirate level has some really tedious and precision-perfect moments that are rather difficult to pull off due to the camera just being an asshole for no reason. And let's not forget the objectively worst level in the whole game, the Pool of the Ancient Dead, where you need to get these 8 lost souls for the boatman, and each time you get one, a bridge breaks, and you gotta do some really specific precision platforming that you will, especially during your first playthrough, constantly be falling into. Excluding the chalices, you can also revisit levels with weapons or items that you get in later ones and then find secret areas. Like for example, after you get the club or the hammer, you can revisit Dan's crypt and go over here to this wall, break it down with said weapon and get yourself an extra life bottle and some gold. Or you can just explore the levels regardless, and if you're really particular with where you look, you can find even more secrets. Like at the start of the Return to the Graveyard level, this bridge over here falls when you step on it, but if you time yourself just right, you can have it land you on this boat, which will then carry you over here and give you access to all these goodies. Or in the same level when you walk along this path and land onto a health fountain, or in the same area on the first graveyard level where it leads to coins. There's stuff like this all throughout the game, and I really just can't help but love it and appreciate it so much. You should reward your players and encourage them to explore and get lost in your worlds. I also love all the little details that they didn't really need to add but did anyways to make the game even more interesting, like Dan's spine stretching out with his head when he falls, his head making a hollow bonk sound when it hits the ceiling, his head spinning and looking at you whenever you try to look around, and rats and poor innocent zombie hands just minding their business and having the ability to be smashed for coins, and lots of other awesome little details throughout. There's even a moment in the level with the villagers where you can go into a library and just read through the entire history of Gallowmere if you so choose. Yeah, can you tell I love this game? Oh really? What gave it away? Son of a Every single level has different enemies, so I'm not going to go over all of them, but to give you a gist, you'll fight the zombies and imps most commonly, but also other Halloween themed creatures like pumpkins, scarecrows, and whatnot. The AI isn't anything groundbreaking or special, but it does its job, and is pretty decent for what it's worth. The bosses, though, are a pretty big highlight to me. Most of them are special, unique, and pretty memorable overall, like the pumpkin serpent, the dragon, or the awesome stained glass demon. You'll also have access to a pretty wide variety of weapons, ranging from swinging weapons or swords, to smashing weapons like clubs, a hammer, or an axe, to ranged weapons like crossbows, longbows, spears, and other stuff, and even some special weapons like lightning and chicken drumsticks. All of these weapons are received either by playing through the game and finding them through chests, or collecting the chalices as you complete levels. Well, except for the chicken drumstick. Those you can get by completing the Ant Cave's secret mission. It works almost like a bomb, but instead of an explosion, upon detonation they'll turn lower tier enemies into roast chicken, which you could then pick up for a bit of health. It's awesome, but this and lightning are the only weapons in the game you can't replenish your ammo for, so if you do get them, just make sure you use them wisely. Aside from chalices and weapons, you'll find other things in the game world that you might need, like these vials that replenish a portion of your health bottles which essentially give you another life, health pools that replenish health as you stand over them, up to I believe 3 bottles worth. None of these health items which respawn upon replaying a level, so make sure you use them pretty carefully. Gold coins that you can use at merchant gargoyles to replenish ammo for certain weapons. Information gargoyles that often say some goofy cryptic thing that'll turn into useful information if you pay close attention, and various other quest specific items like the witch talisman that grants you access to the pumpkin witch, and the witch that grants you access to the special Ant Caves mission, and the dragon gems that you need to summon the dragon, which upon completion will give you the fire breathing armor that makes you fireproof with it equipped that you need for another level. I don't really need most of the weapons since I mainly use the swords when I play this game, but I do recommend looking for secrets and making use of the ranged weapons, since they give you plenty of ammo to where you don't have to barely scrape by throughout the entire game. The music is, surprise surprise, another thing that really stands out about this game to me. Just like, say for example, Silent Hill, Unreal, Deus Ex, or either of the two Vampire the Masquerade games, the music here just understands what it's representing perfectly, and it really captures the feel, tone, and atmosphere of the game and its world. If you don't play the game with the music, then you're seriously missing out on half of the experience. It was composed by Paul Arnold and Andrew Barnabas, more commonly known as the musical duo Bob and Barn. The devs instructed them... Oh god, there goes my dogs again. The devs instructed them to compose music in Danny Elfman's style, similar to, you guessed it, Tim Burton movies like Beetlejuice, Nightmare Before Christmas, and Batman Returns. All they had was a synthesizer to stimulate the sound of organs and an entire orchestra, and yet they somehow accomplished it. In the game, the music is compressed a little, but it still sounds amazing and really effective and powerful and other stuff. Seriously, just listen to some of these songs. The songs are very gothic, somber, and moody, yet beautiful, and again, understand how the world feels. It's so good. I'd say it's probably one of my favorite game soundtracks in general, and the sequel has a phenomenal one too. Paul or Andrew, that's not me, because Andrew's my name too. If either of you are watching this, I want you guys to know that your music for this game is highly respected by not just me, but quite a bit of people as far as I can tell. Without your work, this game wouldn't quite be the same, despite everything else being done so well. So please keep composing music for games and don't stop anytime soon. The sounds are pretty great too. Everything sounds distinct and memorable and just pleasing to the ears. Especially the healing fountains, which their idle sounds were taken from a floating ghost sound somewhere, and their usage sounds are dynamic to how much health you have, getting higher pitched the more your health goes up. Much more satisfying than it really has any right to be. When your sword clashes with metal, there's a really nice clanky metallic sound to them. Zombies grumble, bats screech, wolves howl, rivers splash, doors make a slow creak. Aside from some pretty now noticeable stock sounds, all the audio is filled with great stuff, so I tip my hat over to the sound design team. On top of that, the voice acting was pretty great, I think, across the board. The dialogue was funny enough a lot of the time, but the performances of every single character were pretty much nailed across the board. All of them felt that they were fully purposed without any random last-minute filler. I love how over-the-top everyone sounds in this game all the time. I mean, it's nuts.
I bet money you be back pushing old daisies by now.
Well, the gargoyles talk much more like calm, wise old people, which I think really fits. But still, Dan was cleverly voiced with grumbling, also fitting considering he's missing his bottom jaw.
Don't be shy, baby. I've seen you giving me the eye. I like you, Daniel. Oh, I love a man who doesn't talk back.
This was achieved by Jason Wilson, the lead artist, grumbling his dialogue lines while gritting his teeth and having a bucket over his head. Clever stuff. Zarok was voiced by the actor Paul Darrow, also very well executed. I have no idea who the hell voiced the Cockney fairies, but they need their own movie at some point.
You have helped to free all the fairy people from the clutches of the filthy and scum.
Before moving on to the Japanese version and the PS4 remake, I did want to bring up Easter eggs and cut content, cause, you know, why the hell not? And also nobody really ever talks about them, so I figured I would. For Easter eggs, Medieval's name was actually a reference to Army of Darkness, which in production was called Medieval Dead, which I think is a really clever title looking back, but I think it suits this game just as well. On top of that, the little zombie hands you see running around throughout the game, as well as the sequel, are also inspired by the choking hands from the severed hand from Evil Dead 2. Another random fun fact, the Ant Caves level was actually inspired by Aliens and was meant to be a really goofy parody of it. Jason also didn't want boring normal fairies in the caves, hence the Bob Hoskins faces and the foul-tempered Cockney gangster voices. I don't think that'll ever get old to me. At the end of the game when you're viewing the credits, you'll notice a line that says, "This game is dedicated to the memory of Mr. Apple. If only we'd never remove his magic hat." And you'll see an apple with an origami hat. For those of you that don't know, which is probably anybody watching this, Mr. Apple was an apple that lead programmer Paul Donovan brought for lunch one day. It was then stolen by another programmer who kept the apple on his desk for a while, until Katie Lee, the mapper, made the apple a paper origami hat. It apparently didn't end up rotting at all, so they ended up keeping it in the offices during production for about 9 months. Then I guess it started rotting. Legend says Mr. Apple never rotted due to the hat's magical powers, and I think I needed that hat pretty badly. Not that much has been cut from the final game as far as I know, but the biggest one was pretty much everything that included the side character Morton the Worm, this little worm dude that lived in Dan's head while he was dead. All we get in the final version was an introduction cutscene to the ghost ship level, where Dan is being chased by a dragon and Morton just kinda shows up abruptly out of nowhere. This was supposedly going to be a Crash Bandicoot style chase level, but got scrapped due to being quote-unquote not fun. All we see with Morton in this cutscene is him peeking out of Dan's head, and for a while I wondered what the hell his purpose was. Apparently during the level where you go into an asylum, there was a cutscene found on the game's disc and its files that got left out, showing Morton opening the asylum doors. This was then supposed to be a section that turned into a 2.5D side-scrolling segment, with you controlling Morton and placing the asylum level right after that. But that level was what ended up getting scrapped, sadly. And the last things I was aware of that got scrapped were 2 other levels, one that was supposed to have Dan swaying in a boat through a river for some reason, and another on a train ride. The only reason I could think of these sections being removed is because they're very different from the core gameplay and changed it from the standard hack, slash, and jump core that the game had in every other level. It's a shame because what was there with all this seemed to me really neat and like a quick little change of pace. Thankfully, some glorious bastard is working on a Unity project of these specifically cut levels. The project is titled Medieval The Missing Memories, and it looks awesome so far. I'm adding this in last minute because I completely forgot about the cheats, but if you pause the game, hold L2 and press out a specific button combination, you can unlock cheat menus. The combination varies based on region, and each of these codes happen to spell out a phrase using the first letter of each button on the code. The North American code spells out "toot so loud," the European one spells out "dust to dust," and the Japanese one spells "lost troll." This cheat menu allows you to enable invulnerability, give Dan the level's chalice even if he hasn't solidified it yet, and lets you immediately complete the level if you want. You can also access a super cheat menu that, like the last one, has the first letter of each button spell out a phrase. For this one, the North American one spells out "stout troll strolls to door," Europe's code spells out "too loud roll troll to door," and Japan spells out "stout loud lord lost loot." God, try to say that 5 times fast. I think it's cool they did this and changed it up for each region. Not sure how people figured out the phrases, but that's pretty nutty to me. The super cheat menu lets you view any of the FMVs, including the cut asylum intro, listen to any of the dialogue pieces, hear any of the sounds, and any of the songs, including the cut track, which I also forgot to mention, sorry. There was a cut song, I don't know why it got cut, but it did. The menu also lets you force the camera into one of 30 different angles, lets you adjust how much money or health Dan has, allows you to give Dan a specific inventory item, or lets you use the super cheat meaning invulnerability, all levels unlocked, every main inventory item, rune, and weapon with full power and ammo. So yeah, quite a bit of stuff in here. Although I only think these cheats should be dabbled with once you finish the game completely. Alright, Japanese Skelly Boy time. So this version, while sort of obscure normally, seems to be rather well known among the medieval community. As I said earlier, this version has a good number of changes, the biggest one being Dan now having a helmet. I couldn't say why this happened for certain, but most people assume it's because a skeleton was seen as a rather odd choice as a protagonist, considering they're associated with negativity over there. So as a cover-up, they gave Good Man Dan a helmet to make him more likable. Which doesn't make much sense to me, because I mean, he's still a skeleton. I mean, look at him, he's still a pile of bones, pile of walking bones. I don't know, man, Japan. So they made Dan have a helmet in every instance. Seriously. I'm not talking just about the game itself. I mean his appearance in every single instance in the game aside from the ending FMV was altered to show the helmet. In all of the other FMVs, the loading screens, the map, and even the main menu where it shows the Dan statue, he's wearing a helmet. He also has a more detailed looking eye instead of just a tiny black pupil, and the game has an entirely different font everywhere, which I think it suits pretty well. It's kinda surreal. I mean, I think most other companies, not only at the time but even today, when making a small little change like this would only bother to change the asset in the game. No big deal, right? Nope. That wasn't enough for these guys. They went the extra mile to make it seem like he's had this helmet in both of the other versions of this game. And that is some fine attention to detail if you ask me. There's other small little changes too though, changes that include the loading screens. There's some completely new ones, including some 3D renders of the Hall heroes. The first life bottle you get is empty and in turn appearing gray in the game when you pick it up. There's some slight difficulty adjustments that are exclusive to this Japanese version and were not in either the NTSC or PAL releases, like the Pumpkin King boss regenerating his health, and the dragon armor draining your health when you have it equipped. Also exclusive is the ability to recharge lightning from the gargoyle merchants after you unlock it, while in both the NTSC and PAL versions, it's limited and completely gone once depleted. Skull chests release a red bomb and a pink shockwave, as opposed to them normally releasing an indigo bomb with a yellow shockwave. If you want, you can burn haystacks in the scarecrow fields for coins, while in other versions burning them does nothing. The only inconsistencies I've noticed are, as I said, the ending FMVs not showing Dan with his helmet, and also for some reason Dan still mumbles English. Unlike literally every other character in the game having a text box appear when they talk, his doesn't have anything appear, which is strange. Isn't that the one you would want the subtitles for? I don't know, man, I just work here. All in all, this is a great version of the game to play, but I don't recommend it for a first time playthrough, especially if you don't speak Japanese. To me, it's really cool being so familiar with this game all my life, By all my life, I mean by the past few years. But it was cool seeing all these things that I was so familiar with, and then playing the same game, but something that still feels very different from what I'm used to. It was awesome. And lastly, I did want to talk about the remake and its differences. Again, not the PSP one titled Resurrection, but the one on the PS4. You're going to want to be playing this on the PS4 Pro, as playing it on a standard PS4 will have some pretty wonky inconsistencies in regards to performance. If you play on a Pro, as far as I'm told, you would have a pretty consistent 60 FPS. First things first, this is extremely faithful as far as remakes go. Now, I was pleasantly surprised and excited when I first played it. I couldn't believe how much they got right. I mean, they even started up with the iconic Halloween-y main menu, how they took some of the improvements from Medieval 2 and implemented them here, and even went ahead and added some of their own touches. I think it's a nearly perfect remake, honestly. Nearly. The biggest and really only negative I have is, ironically enough, the graphics. Not quite the graphics, since they're obviously way better, but instead the art design. Everything does look more pleasing to the eyes, but that's kind of the problem at the same time, and I know I sound ungrateful, but it kind of missed the mark on what the original was going for in that regard. The old had small touches of humor sprinkled here and there to keep things refreshing, and to remind you not to take it all too seriously, but it always felt more like a gothic Tim Burton-esque film that was made into a game. While in this remake, it feels more silly and cartoony, more whimsically Disney kind of fantasy, and not quite gothic horror. And also, I think the PS1 graphics were pretty much perfectly suited for that type of feel too, so in turn it being better and more polished up here kind of took away from that. That's not really something I can knock, because I mean, this is a remake after all. Remakes are supposed to look better, and they tried, so. Though I will say on its own it looks absolutely stunning. Even better in my opinion than its PS1 mascot brethren Crash and Spyro got with their HD remake master things. I did think it was an awesome little nod to hardcore fans of the game that they sprinkled Mr. Apple throughout the game's levels. Not something most people are going to know about, but I know. I know, you clever little bastards. And also, if you're watching this video, you probably do too now, because I mentioned him earlier in the video. As far as gameplay, they did add a good amount of stuff to improve upon the original formula. The controls are more or less the same as the originals, and taken from Medieval 2 is the ability to equip 2 weapons at once and switch between them at will, as opposed to just one at a time in the original. Also, the second stick being used to look around, though that's kind of a given in games these days, and also using L2 to have Dan strafe around instead of moving left or right. Exclusively for this version, as far as I know, you can use R2 to do a legitimate behind-the-shoulders third-person perspective, which is pretty cool. The health pools thankfully refill every time you replay levels now, making this remake a lot easier. There's now a book thing that shows all the enemies, items, and weapons, which are also awesome. The audio is completely remastered, which would mean they kept the original uncompressed audio, and here's a before and after if you wanted to hear the difference.
Welcome to Castle Peregrine. In the time of King Peregrine, this magnificent edifice was the seat of power and home to the royal household. Now it is home only to ghosts and forgotten memories. Welcome to Castle Peregrine. In the time of King Peregrine, this magnificent edifice was the seat of power and home to the royal household. Now it is home only to ghosts and forgotten memories.
Music is completely redone from the graveyard up, this time with a genuine orchestra. And here's another before and after comparison of that. Books now have a woman that sounds either like a witch or a warlock narrating everything when you read them. Everything is more animated now, kind of like a Pixar movie, which again can be a good or bad thing depending on your viewpoint, and again a bit of a negative to me that builds off my criticism with the new art style. On the other hand, they did manage to capture the same essence with a character named Jack the Green. It's a bit more in the uncanny valley realm with him, since everything throughout the game is animated pretty smoothly, while he's the only thing in the game that looks like he's still in a Tim Burton film, which to me is pretty charming. I just wish they had more of that in this remake. And no, I'm not talking about the game just locking the frame rate down to something low. I mean, the way this is animated looks more like something in that, as opposed to this. I don't really know how to explain it, but I'm not talking just about the frame rate. The merchant gargoyles now have their own menu thing with their own original elevator music thing going on. Overall, everything else is largely the same, and this makes it feel more like a remaster than a remake, as I've been saying. But it is a remake since things have been taken out and put in, and everything has been redone completely. Some people found issue with that it was too similar and said that this game belongs stuck in the past. And no, I completely disagree. I instead really applaud them for having the balls to keep this as faithful as it could possibly be in the modern age, while still adding its own touches and improvements. I think if anything, this game has aged really well, give or take the clunky camera and some of the weird controls. But I think everything other than that has really held up and stood the test of time. And I think this remake is a testament to that, because there's a lot of people that have never played this game before, and then they play the remake for the first time and end up really liking it and then wanting to go back. Now, I don't know about you, but if you ask me, that's the sign that a remake has done its job effectively and is faithful. This remake improves pretty much everything upon the original game in really every way it can, so it gets a pretty good reputation in my book. Oh yeah, also, this thing had a 2-level demo, which was great. It took up way too much space, but it was an awesome demo and it made me freak out in excitement when I first played it, constantly anticipating every hour towards its release. Upon completion of the demo, you unlock the ability to equip the helmet and play it in the full version. This is the same helmet from the Japanese version, which is already awesome in of itself, but equipping it actually turns the game into a hard mode, going above its original intent and giving it some sort of purpose outside of cosmetics. So if you do get this remake, be sure to play the demo first. It is on the cheaper side physically, but I don't really see much of a reason to get that unless you just like collecting stuff. It costs $30 US on the PSN store for the standard one, or $40 for the digital deluxe one, which is the one I'd suggest getting if you're a big fan of the series, due to all the bonus goodies that it comes with. But otherwise, if you just want to play this and you never have before, I would stick with the standard. I love the PS4 theme it comes with, and I've had it as my standard theme ever since. Aside from that in the game itself, it also comes with a digital art book, a soundtrack thing with its own player and slideshow, and a digital comic book with sounds and voice acting that ended up getting an actual comic book release shortly after. Should you get it over the PS1 original? Well, considering this has the PS1 original, or if you don't actually have a PS1, then probably yeah, since it's going to be much more accessible. And also the goodies that come with the digital deluxe version are awesome. But what about the game in general? Is Medieval worth playing, and does it still hold up today? Building off what I pretty much just said, I think the game aged really well. Aside from the camera specifically being really awkward, the platforming being a little wonky, which makes sense considering its age, and the controls being a little strange than what you're probably going to be used to, I do think it's something that's easy to pick up and get adjusted to after a level or two of playing, and if you've never played it but are willing to give it the chance, then I say yeah, go pick this bad boy up, whether it's the good old original or the PS4 Remake. Although I personally prefer the original for the much darker atmosphere and art style. It's one of those games I'd even go as far as to say that it's a must play before you die. It's charming as all heck. The gameplay is simple yet fun and addictive, the levels are all different and special with their own little things going for them, the puzzles can be challenging without being too frustrating, The visuals are absolutely beautiful to me despite their low poly PS1 era chunkiness. I mean, yeah, graphics can be good or bad, but what good will graphics do without a good art team, you know? It's about the art design, and I think the low polyness of it works well with the game's tone. Also, the art in general is just perfect in here, making the game really visually pleasing to me. Also, the phenomenal soundtrack, the game being just as fun the second or even third time around, just, man, everything about this game really is done so well and sticks out. Stop watching this and go play the damn game already. You can thank me later. Just don't forget to play it on a CRT, kiddos. Stay in vegetables, eat your drugs, and don't do school. Wait. Thanks for watching this RetroDeath review thing. If you enjoyed this, I make other videos on darker and older games, usually more on the PC, but I plan to do more PS1 stuff too over the coming years. Be sure to check those other videos out, subscribe if you so choose with the bell thingy to know when I make more. I got a Patreon page if you want to help me pay the rent, and I will try to be more consistent with my upload schedule. But for now, as always, thank you very much for watching.